Welcome to It's No Secret, a podcast for those who want their money questions answered.
Join us as we talk to real Kiwis and share truths about our own financial lives, because the truth is, there is no secret to achieving financial freedom. Back to another episode of It's No Secret. Today we're chatting about how to break up with someone financially, whether that's a service that you pay for, a person, or potentially your parents, or, you know, someone like an insurance provider. Lots of different areas in which you might want to separate yourself and your payments or your money from another party. So we're going to dig into that, I guess, in terms of like, what are some of the considerations? What are the pitfalls you fall into when you're going through this type of financial breakup? What are some of the things to consider? But before we dive into that, Christine, tell us some scary stats.
We love the shock factor, clearly.
Yeah, shock factor away.
Okay, cool. To set the scene. So there's two bits of research that we can kind of point to set the scene. The first one is there was an independent UK article that I was reading that was published in early 2023, so roughly a year and a half ago, that said 30% of people admit they're only staying with their partner because they fear not being able to afford living alone, which is a sad stat in a lot of ways.
Yes.
The Stowe family law quizzed 500 people across the UK aged 25 to 74 and also noted that many couples are deciding not to go ahead with divorce in the current climate due to financial worries. So yeah, that is also another scary one.
It is.
Then separate piece of research was from the Retirement Commission in November 2023, so about a year ago, and they found that the high cost of separation later in life, with that, 64% of people say they feel financially uncomfortable after separation compared to 21% before, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, it sets a little bit of a grim scene, but hopefully it's not all lost.
I think it's interesting because obviously there's quite a bit of research or more research available around people that have gone through financial separations, because that's quite an easy like cohort of people to obviously look into, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And it gets a fair bit of airtime because it ties into other factors like making sure that there is like equitability between partners with, say, like KiwiSaver balances, and making sure that people that take time out of the workforce for raising families aren't like punitively impacted and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting that there's obviously quite a bit of stats around divorce and separation from a financial standpoint, but where there's not really any stats is like breaking up with financial services just throughout your life, which happens to everybody whether or not they think about it.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to hear, because I know that you have some personal scenarios. I have a personal scenario as well that rolls with this, but it's like, I think it's interesting to think about breaking up with a financial service because it's often the cost of inaction and, you know, delaying breaking up with a financial service that you no longer see value from. Yeah. That is the big issue as opposed to the actual breakup. Yeah. So do you want to maybe tell us your story first and then we can kind of pick that apart?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the good example that I have, and if you're a regular listener of the podcast, you'll know that I've talked about this in the sense that how much I was spending with a personal trainer. So that was something that I decided ultimately just didn't fit in my budget anymore. And I guess... Oh, yeah.
So did you tell them that? Is that how you led with the breakup?
No, definitely not.
Okay, tell me more. Like, why?
Because I guess, I mean, I hope she doesn't listen to the podcast, but
Is that because it's an even more ruthless reason?
No, it's just not the full truth. I mean, I
did you white lie it?
Yeah, a little bit.
Classic.
Yeah. I said that we decided that we were going to save for a home, and we basically had no money.
This really just sums up Kiwis.
I know.
Like,
this is like the people pleasing stuff, right?
Correct.
Don't
want to offend anyone.
I hope this is not a social media clip. Yeah. Tim,
okay.
No, but yeah. So I think I did procrastinate on it quite a bit. I think I probably went over about a month more than I would have liked to, and that was literally because I just didn't know how to say it to her, and which is very on brand for me. Yep. And I guess it probably ended up costing me like $800 extra than it could have, which is not insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, I guess you then have to ask yourself, where else am I applying this logic, or like letting the people pleasing part of me mean that I'm financially being penalized, or, you know,
just
like,
fear of confrontation as well, right?
Basically.
Or fear of like letting people down or offending someone, or just having a difficult conversation. I feel like there's lots of different services, right? It's like this could be an accountant. This could be a personal trainer. Yep, a financial advisor. I'm trying to think of what else like you potentially pay for that.
Well, there's like loyalty tax. You know, you can apply it to
but
like
I think that's a little when it's like a person and it's a service and you actually have to front up. Like I don't have to call AMI and be like, "Hi, I'm moving to Tower." Like, they don't care.
It's like your KiwiSaver, right? You can just literally go to the new provider.
Exactly. And so I feel like, you know, people are a little bit more equipped to deal with that kind of financial breakup from a provider that's faceless. But the minute it has a face and a person attached, it's like, ooh,
oh my God, people here. Like,
another one, cleaner. If you have a cleaner in your house. I'm just thinking of like anything that's, I guess, is kind of like service based where there's a person involved. Yeah.
I can also see how like wealth management in the sense that it's so like one-to-one relationship based is so hard to move your money away from if you don't believe in it anymore, because that's like the guilt that comes from being like talked out of doing that, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
What's your example?
So my example is breaking up with our financial advisor. And I did this in like the worst possible way because because it sort of happened when we essentially decided to put the financial advice services that we were receiving on hold during COVID when Luke lost his job, which made a lot of sense because it was like, hey, we've had a significant change in income. We don't need this right now. We're not even a space to be like thinking about growing our money and having financial planning. And then we never really confirmed or broke up. Like I just essentially like quiet quit on them after that, which is the worst. And you know what? To this day, I still feel guilty about it.
Oh, it's like ghosting.
Yes, because I never had the conversation, and I'm like, I feel so bad about that. So don't take that strategy.
Did it just like fizzle out and you just stopped replying or something?
It just sort of fizzled out, and then I guess they were kind of like, well, you guys are clearly not going to be clients anymore. And then one day they kind of just sent me a letter basically being like, we're downgrading you to this service just so it's really clear that you're basically on like the lowest tier, and they're still helping us with our insurances, but we're not getting any other services. And if we wanted other services, it would be on like a billable hours basis.
Right.
So yeah, that was, I mean, not fantastic. I'm just going to blame COVID. I just wasn't in the best headspace. So that's my excuse. But don't take that by example. I think in like, you know, if this is a situation that you're facing or you feel like you have, I mean, you're going to know because it's that feeling in your gut, right? Like you just know.
Yeah.
So like, firstly, you just know. Secondly, I think it's like you have to figure out how you're going to tell the person. And actually, other good example of this is we have a nanny that we obviously love. And recently we wanted to reduce her hours a little bit for a pure financial reason.
Yeah.
Like we basically needed to save a little bit more money. Yeah. And it was one of those things where she was essentially going a bit above and beyond for us. And we were like, we can rein this back a little bit. But it's really tough because you instantly feel guilty about that because I'm like, us saving money is a direct loss of income to her.
Yes.
But it's our decision. And you are making a choice for you. And I was the one that like made the choice because I did the budgeting that led us to this choice. And then I completely chickened out on having this conversation and I just handballed it to Luke.
Oh my God. Wait, so how did Luke play it? Or like, what did he?
Funnily enough, we like kind of not role played it, but like we talked through what he was going to say because I said to him, I was like, you need to make it really clear that this is based on a fact and circumstance of us, not a representation of that person's like service, because it's absolutely not. And we didn't want to have any, you know, like vague conversation around it because it would be terrible if she felt like we didn't value her service. And that's why we were making the decision. So and it was funny because his starting point was like, oh no, we shouldn't tell her that we're like, it's tight on budget. And I'm like, no, I think you should lead with the facts.
Yeah.
This is what we talk about all the time. Like people can't argue with the fact of how your current situation needs to be and it's not a reflection of them. And so if you lead with essentially, in this case, we did the whole like, we've revised our budget. We need to really just save some money with where we're at right now and what we want to do in the next kind of 12 to 18 months. And as part of that, we've assessed like all different areas where we're spending and we would like to reduce your hours as part of that. And that's the reason why. And then it's sort of, you're not entering into like a conversation. It's no reflection of the value that they're providing. It's just a case of like, this is why we did this thing. It's the truth.
It's not a personal thing. It's
No,
a business thing.
exactly.
Yeah.
And trying to take it in like a business approach.
Yeah. And did she receive it well?
Yeah.
That's
She
good.
did. She was
She's
completely fine.
Oh,
and
good. That's great.
Yeah. And like,
That's
it's
nice.
not been a problem. And that was
Perfect.
all good. But yeah.
Love it. I can relate to that with the personal trainer thing in the sense that I think the reason that I was so like nervous about it is because I definitely felt like, you know, a PT works on they're a contractor essentially.
Yeah.
And like, I was like, I'm directly impacting your livelihood, you know, like it's that piece.
You feel guilty.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
But she received it really well as well and was like, you know, I totally understand and like
Yes.
ready if you want to come back. I'm like, okay, great. And it's like,
Did you have the conversation face to face or did you text her?
I texted.
Fucking knew it.
I avoided that.
I love
that.
Look, I empathize. I'm not here to judge. I couldn't even have the conversation face to face. That's why I was like bringing in the cavalry. Luke, come on.
Do you know what's also? I literally left it to the very last minute.
Classic you.
Yeah, that's very. I procrastinated right till I was like the 24-hour point before.
Oh, needing to make a decision.
or just before the next.
Oh no. Okay.
But she was
okay.
fine. She's
So the moral of this podcast to date is like learn from Christine and my mistakes.
Just also maybe
Don't
don't
do what we do.
procrastinate. Like I think it's better to just nip it in the bud. Count down from 3.
I think your point as well, like you said, it's like a business decision. I think the reason that I feel more comfortable about this is being in a role at work where we do have to make a lot of decisions based on how we spend money and certain parts of a budget. And often that involves like saying yes or no to certain services or contractors or people.
Yeah.
I get very used to doing that in a work environment that's just basically like kind and fair. You know, you don't need to be liked by everyone, but you just need to be seen as like fair and obviously try and do that in a kind manner.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, like your household and your money is your own little business.
It's true.
And to your point of view, like, well, we've made a business decision.
Yeah. I cannot afford
I am the
it.
CFO of my family. Like I've made a business decision that this is what we need to do. And I'm just going to try and approach it with a like slightly business mentality and do that in a kind way. I feel like people can't argue with that. And ultimately most people are receptive and will understand and it's not going to cause conflict.
Yeah, and I also think like if the person doesn't receive it well, that's not a reflection of you. It's a reflection of
Them.
where they're at. Firstly.
Exactly.
But then also, like it's better to like confront or like do it up front than it is to ghost because I think that's a worst. Don't ghost anybody. Yeah. Because it's like, you know, think about dating. Have you ever been on a date and then just never heard from the person? I would much rather the person be like,
yes,
look, thanks for the drink, but not my thing. See ya.
Yep.
Like, and
Exactly.
savage, but whatever. Like, at least you know where you stand.
Exactly right. And also if you think about it from their point of view, like they're losing value from chasing you as essentially like a lost lead, right? So if you're being upfront with that person, that's then basically setting them free to go and spend that time pursuing someone else that they could provide their services to and therefore make more money. So, you know, it's also the point of view of like, that's fine. That does them a benefit too, because then they're like, okay, Christine's not on my client roster at the moment. I'm going to reach back out to some other people that were interested because now I have capacity.
Yeah, I agree.
Happy days for everyone.
Man, I'm applying this to the marketing budget. Like, just like, not ours, obviously, well, kind of, but like, you know, when you get inquiries and you're just like, oh, yeah, this is a cool idea. I'll entertain it for a minute. And then you get sucked into like the pitch and everything. And then you're like, oh, shit, now I have to say no. But that was fun for that call. Like,
Exactly.
anyway.
Oh, people, services.
Yeah. So
Okay.
another one is parents.
Yep.
Yeah.
On the same vein of people.
Yeah, exactly. I have personal experience with this in terms of, and I think the reason, I mean, I wanted to talk about it was because financially breaking up with your parents isn't like you never accept a coffee from them ever again. What I more meant by this is like the point at which you kind of cut the financial umbilical cord. So it's like you decide I am going to do these like my money and things on my terms to the point, and I've like to full transparency experience, like money is a bit of a control in that sense in terms of like if I pay for this you do X, like X or Y.
There are strings attached.
Yeah, always. And so I think it was an interesting experience for me personally deciding like, okay, this is the line, and actually I'm going to start saying no to those things because the like benefit of not, it brings me more happiness than taking it and having to do things that I don't want to do.
Yeah. Interesting that you have taken it from that approach, because there's also the opposite, right? Which is that your parents just decide to break up with you.
Oh, true.
You know,
yeah,
so it's like, I feel like
Kick you out, you're on your own.
Correct. Like this is one of those things that I have seen
That's
play
true.
out in both situations where it's like some parents do take a hard line of you've met this threshold, whether that's been you finished school and you've gotten a job and like you're on your own, I'm not paying for your phone bill anymore, like you do
Buy your own
XYZ,
clothes, yeah.
exactly, all those things. And I think like depending on your family situation and obviously your parents' values around money, that can be very clear. But also to your point, I feel like sometimes parents like quiet quit on their children as well though, right?
Really?
If they're not, if they're not comfortable in having that conversation, but it's creating a strain on them financially and they're not comfortable, you know, just having the exact conversation we talked about just before with their own child to basically encourage them to be financially independent on their own, then how do they slowly withdraw and like pay for less and less and less, or you know, introduce things like, okay, you're still living at home and you're 19, we're going to start charging you board now as an incentive for you to start moving out or considering other options. We're going to make your ability to be here more uncomfortable or more like the real world so that you take the hint.
Yeah, the massive financial hint. Yeah.
Exactly. Because I remember like mum and dad took a slightly different approach, I think, to your parents in that they made it very clear that basically up until school finishing, we will obviously fund you and let you live here, and you don't have any requirements to get a part-time job outside of it being for your own benefit and interest. And they were like, and we're happy for you to focus on school so that you can get into university, but then once you get into university, like that's it. And if you don't get into the university of your choice, too bad, so sad, we're not helping you out financially to do that. You need to get in off your own merit. And then once you're there, they moved all of the kind of, like, I remember that was the tipping point when I started uni where I had to like pay for my own phone, pay for my own insurance. I didn't have to pay for food, but I had to start paying board and like petrol and all that kind of, like my own registration, like all my own expenses for my car and that kind of stuff. And then they were basically like, and then that was right. We did that whilst we were at school. And then the next threshold up was once we finished university, if we were still living at home, there was like another step up in the amount that you needed to pay because on the provision that we had a full-time job.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Because that's what happened.
I feel like that's reasonable.
Yeah. Otherwise, they're like, you're just
move
cruising
out.
and literally, and like,
like you get to save your full salary. What?
Exactly, kind of thing. So they just outwardly like put that on me.
Yeah.
So I never really then had to think about actively breaking up with them because they were kind of inadvertently doing that over time with me. And then it got to the point where I was like, okay, well, I am just doing all my own stuff and paying for my own bills and not worrying about them needing to ask them for money.
Yeah. That's cool. I think that's a great approach. Like, I think it's a good way to kind of educate your kids about the reality of like being financially independent as an adult, really.
And can be quite gentle rather than just like ripping the Band-Aid off and be like, see, you're done, bye, you're out on your own, which some people have to do. So it's like, if that's the requirement from a financial standpoint, that's also fine.
Yeah.
You know, it can just sometimes be obviously a bit challenging for that child dependent on where they're at.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think that, I mean, I feel like it would require a lot of discipline for you as the parent to actually like enforce it. Do you know what I mean? Because, you know, ultimately like love the kid and you want to help them and stuff, right?
Also, I'm pretty sure like mum will probably listen to this and be like, this is not true, but it so is. Like I had it harder as the older child, whereas I always have that perception of like they were a bit easier on my brother with that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, mum in particular has a real sweet spot for my brother and very much just sometimes like treats him like he's not capable of doing stuff even though he's doing fantastically. And I'm like, Mum, if you looked at this objectively, you'd realise that like him and I are both equally capable, but you're still kind of giving him a little bit of like extra cushioning. I reckon. Less so from a financial sense now and more so wrapped up in like other, you know, like
emotional support.
Like she'll offer to do his washing and stuff. And I'm like, Mum,
he can wash. He knows how to use a dryer.
I mean, she does the same thing for Luke. She comes to our house and she just does all of Luke's ironing. And I'm like, Mum.
You're like, where's mine?
I'm like, the man has arms. Like, he can iron a shirt.
It's so funny.
Anyway.
Do you know what though? I do think it is an older sibling thing because I reckon it happened with Caroline as well. And
they set the firm rule and then perhaps they
it
relent a
softens
little bit.
Yeah. And then the middle child is just a whole nother thing.
Exactly.
The one that's,
But I mean, to your point of like, if you're the opposite, right, and your parents are not the ones initiating the breakup with you, how do you navigate then doing that?
Yeah, good question. I think it's an internal choice that you just have to come to and stand by it and have discipline, because there's always going to be like an opportunity for it to repeat itself. And maybe I'm a bit cynical, classic, play into my character, but I just also, if there's a behavior of like control linked to money, it's going to repeat itself. And at some point you need to decide what the trade-off is, because it's like, if you are then going to accept money, but then that requires you to do X, Y, Z, and then you find yourself complaining about the fact that you need to do X, Y, Z.
Yes.
Then I think that's where the personal responsibility comes in, to be like,
so true.
You made this choice.
So true.
Do you know what I mean?
You see this 100% with weddings, right?
Oh, yeah,
like
exactly.
This is basically what people say when parents fund weddings, and they're like, well, my parents are paying for this wedding so they can just have whatever they want, even though I am like grimly depressed. And that's how it, but I have had so many conversations with that, because it is that thing of like, when you have, someone funding anything, there are always strings attached, even if they say there aren't.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so with that, financial breakups with our partner.
Yes. Juicy.
Yes. Tricky.
Yeah. Hard.
We've obviously talked a little bit before on the show about the considerations with partners in terms of when you become de facto and that type of stuff. So I think in talking about this, we're just going to have the underlying assumption that we're talking about two people that are either legally married or defined as being in a de facto relationship, and therefore they start to come under the law where assets are being separated between the two of them, as opposed to someone that you have been dating for a year that you may have one joint bank account with, but you separate and you kind of go your separate ways with what you entered the relationship with.
Yeah.
So some grim but not surprising stats about the fact that people feel financially uncomfortable after separation. I mean, that is a bit of a like, of course, because you had X and you now have half of that, if you're lucky. And you've, really had a few expenses come out along the way, potentially, in order for you to get there. It's also really, really hard to rebuild. I don't know if we have any stats around like the average age of divorce, but one of the things that obviously we know about when it comes to money and growing your wealth is that time really, really matters.
Yes.
And so let's like play out a scenario where you are with a partner in your 20s and then you're basically together for 20 odd years and you separate in your 40s and you are then essentially starting from scratch on your own. You then have a much smaller working window in order to really build that nest egg and kind of put yourself back into a just comfortable position for retirement and your life. So that's really, really hard. But also the reality is that most relationships end in divorce. Isn't it still over 51%?
Oh, it must be something high like that.
Yeah. So, it is pretty high, and it is a reality for a lot of people. So
I found the average divorce age.
Okay, tell me.
So in 2023, the median age at divorce was 48.1 for men and 45 for women, while back in 2003, the median age was 42 for men and 40 for women. So people are getting divorced later slightly.
Probably because they're also getting married later.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And or like, being in a relationship for longer before they potentially get married and then potentially divorcing later. That's pretty rough though. Like even if you think about it from a female's point of view, if you're wanting to retire at 65 and you're getting divorced at 45 and you then have 20 years versus, a normal sort of 40-year time frame to build for that, that's tricky. And for men, if you're older and 48, It's rough.
Especially also, I mean, like thinking about the role that you've played in that relationship. You know, have you had to make sacrifices of your career around your career, and that's going to obviously have a flow-on effect to your like earning ability, and therefore
what jobs you're going back to.
Yeah, what you can
even
achieve
if you're
in that
both
20
working
years.
and then you have children. Like, are you able to both keep working in the capacity that you were as a couple?
Yeah.
Because you might be like parenting individually, and
True.
all that kind of stuff can have flow-on effects to both people's ability to earn at the rate that they were like in the marriage.
Yeah.
And therefore, you know, go forward from there. So, I mean, first thing that we kind of can talk about is like you want to kind of prepare pre-divorce. What I mean by that is we've obviously talked about like you want to make sure that you protect any assets that are particularly valuable to you that have been attributed to you as an individual pre coming into a relationship, and we've talked about that a lot before. So that's by way of like contracting out agreements and the likes, which basically just acknowledge that, you know, if Christine's coming into a relationship with Ollie and she has a house, for example, that she had prior to that relationship, it might be agreed between them that that's contracted out, and therefore if you guys were say together for 20 years and then at the end of that 20 years you separate, it's only the assets that you accumulated together during that period of time that fall under a separation agreement. It's not the house that you originally had. That's your house, and that's, you know, treated differently.
For
sure. So obviously getting some like advice when it's all really like rosy and fantastic. But then, you know, figuring out, well, okay, so this relationship is ending and we need to financially start thinking about separation. Where do we even start?
Well, I was just going to say on the prep, I also think there's like some smaller things that you can do as well in terms of like getting your own kind of finances in order. I mean, like an example that I had for the PT was that I had already cancelled my gym membership before I told her. And so I had a very hard deadline that I forced myself into doing it. And so maybe there's like, you could kind of replicate that in some form of relationship really around like, what are you doing to like prime the situation?
And keeping track of assets, you know, I think one thing that's super common in relationships, whether it starts out this way or not, is that people invariably play different roles in a family unit that we've talked about. So, you know, I'm the family CFO. There are certain things that are collective money that are solely in my name that I kind of have access to that would be a little bit harder for Luke to have access to because he'd need to figure out like what email address is associated with it and that kind of stuff. And so, I often think, you know, whilst people don't necessarily have to keep a really detailed balance sheet, but being across what your collective assets are as a couple and just where those things are held, partly for great estate planning purposes, but also just for transparency and like honesty between the two of you, so that should the relationship actually disintegrate, you understand like this is where our savings have been kept and this is where we've invested. Whether or not you're the person that's actively managing that account can be very helpful.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, that's a very good point in terms of like getting access to those things and ensuring you have an oversight for sure. Nice.
Exactly.
So you've got your oversight. Now what are we doing?
Hopefully you invest in staying married for a while, but let's just skip to the part where life happens, things go on. It's really interesting because actually talking to a financial advisor about this recently, we work with someone at Kernel who deals with a lot of post-divorcees or new divorcees, right? And she said that there's a couple of common themes that come through. One is that people engage a financial advisor too late, and then on reflection, when she's working with them, she's potentially had some scenarios where she's felt that the person could have received more in a financial separation than they actually did, or that should have been more across like figuring out the negotiation piece and didn't have, you know, during that would have had a lawyer helping them, but didn't necessarily have someone with like deep financial planning knowledge that could kind of help them figure out, okay, well, is this actually enough for, you know, your future versus this other person's future? Who's going to have future expenses? Where does like the earning potentials sit between the two of you and that kind of stuff? So she said that's kind of one, is that people engage lawyers soon because most people know that they sort of have to do that. But then they don't necessarily engage someone that can help them with the money side. And then the other thing is that she sees a lot of people that come to her with the expectation that what they've received is a lot and that their disconnect from what they've received versus what it actually costs for them to set themselves up as a single person is quite disproportionate. And it's the simple things of there is a minimum threshold to overcome to buy a property, for example, right? And that's made more complex by the fact that most people separating probably can't just go and buy a one-bedder. You know, they possibly need to be buying a certain size house to facilitate children or other things. That's then like a minimum financial hurdle for you to overcome. You then need to overlay that with like, are you entirely cash funding that from your separation payment or do you need to get a mortgage? If you need to get a mortgage, what does your serviceability look like as a single individual? What does that then force you to go and do from a work and income point of view? Who's going to look after your kids? All that kind of stuff. And so her general sense was that most people tend to be in a position where they overestimate what they can do with the money. And she's predominantly then having conversations of like, okay, you might be able to get the house, but you absolutely have to work and you'll be working for the next 20 years and you need to rebuild. And like, this is on you now to essentially secure your future, which is a pretty tough conversation to have.
Yeah. It's also just really sad. Like that's
it is
happening a lot, you know.
It
but
is.
I've honestly never thought about having a financial advisor on your team with divorce because you just go straight to lawyers.
A lawyer.
But then it's like, well, they're not planning finances.
No, they're not. And I mean, a lawyer is obviously going to have a huge range of skills depending on what you need, right? Because some people as well will be aligning a lawyer that's potentially really strong in family law because if there are kids involved and they really need to ensure that like custody agreements are negotiated well or, you know, heaven forbid it's going down the path of like getting to family court, they probably want someone specializing in that. And, you know, a lot of parents would be concerned about that, but potentially not seeking as much external input on the financial planning side or kind of figuring out how you do that. Interestingly as well, like understanding kind of how this works, you have to basically kind of set a date in which you separate under New Zealand law, and then 2 years post that date you can apply for a divorce. Now during that period of time you can actually undergo your own financial separation agreement, and so most people don't need to go through the courts, they just get individual lawyers. Or if you're super amicable and I don't know, you're both really practical and perhaps there's no kids, it's just two individuals, and you know, like if it was you and Ollie and you were like, I think we could actually reach a fair and reasonable agreement, just the two of us, you don't need a lawyer. You can just basically draft up the separation agreement, probably have it reviewed and then sign it.
Happy days.
Exactly. Happy days. If you're legally married, you then have to also go through the like legal process to get divorced. But if you think about it from the point of view of like the divorce is actually just the very end bit.
It's everything to get there.
Exactly. It's everything to get there. And it's everything from the point in which you need to start living independently where you immediately start needing to have a plan about the money. Because in order for people to live independently, the baseline assumption there is that you're going to start incurring another expense, right? Because someone might stay in the primary house, someone might need to go and get an apartment or move elsewhere. Who's funding that? Can you fund that together? Like, does that force a sale of the home sooner so that you can do that? You know, you very quickly get from the emotionally traumatic part of recognizing that you're separating to also needing to very practically and efficiently make some decisions around money, which, as we know from doing this podcast, is not most people's strong suits at the best of times, let alone at the worst of emotional times. And so that's why I'm like, of course it makes sense to go and get an advisor or someone that can help you. Maybe it's your accountant if you have a really close relationship with someone. It's just someone that can provide you advice.
In the financial space.
Exactly. Because I also see, you know, that in these scenarios, like people will rely on or lean on family members, but that's not necessarily equitable between two parties, right? Like,
everyone has their biases as well, right? Like everyone's always going to put their flavour on it unless you are an objective third party that is being paid to give
and your
advice.
family's probably going to advocate for you.
Yeah, they are.
You know,
so
which as they probably should. But it's one of those cases of like, let's say, you know, there is a couple and one person has like financial experience within their family. They've immediately got a leg up potentially over someone else that doesn't. And so it's then also thinking about like who's in your support network. And if you don't have friends and family that are happy to be across the details, because there's a lot of big ifs here, right? Like happy to be across the details, you're comfortable sharing the full details with, you're actually going to take their advice. Very hard to take advice from family and friends, again, at the best of times. Easier to hear it from, an independent third party that perhaps you're just paying, like a professional services fee for. And so, it was very interesting, like I think from that point of view. Also kind of highlights, and this is having had some friends go through separations, highlights the need to make sure that you have access to money that you can use to start engaging with these services. Because of course, I think like one of the prohibiting factors to people is, okay, I recognize I need to go get a lawyer. If I want to engage that person, I'm going to have to start paying fees. I'm possibly going to have to front up a few $1,000s for a retainer. Similarly, if I want to go talk to an advisor, probably going to have to pay them a bit of money. And depending on your situation, like let's play out a scenario where I only had access to my ASB fund money. I get $278 a fortnight. Like it's going to take me a lot of fortnights to get a few $1,000s. I'm very reliant on needing genuine access to our joint banking. And in order to do that, I need to make sure that either like Luke and I are in an amicable situation or I've, withdrawn some money into my own savings account.
Yeah, and I mean, I was just playing out like scenarios of that as you're talking, in the sense that I've definitely, like, I know people who have left, like divorced, or, but basically they've just been so like, I need to get out of this, that they were just also really willing to give up a lot more than maybe than they should have, and to emotionally protect themselves, but then have inadvertently ended up worse off when they were the one that also grew the asset.
Right.
Which is quite, like, I guess it's just, the point is to make sure you have support to like be able to put that barrier between your emotions and the facts, really.
And have someone be in your corner to advocate for you, because in that scenario, if you can't advocate for yourself because you need to remove yourself from the situation, that's totally valid. Doesn't mean you can't sub someone else in to do that, right? Like you can do that. It's probably just going to cost you a bit of money, but you can do that.
For sure.
And so making sure that, you have, support around you, I think is key, because there was also a bit of a like vacuum of information. Like there's just not a lot out there, I think, if you find yourself in this scenario, and people tend to lean on friends and family, and like they've not necessarily had the best or most relevant experience in this space anyway. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's such a tricky one, and it's it is very situational and obviously relationship based, and how amicable and things you are that can impact that. But just, I guess, thinking about like relationship property, what does that cover at a high level for someone that hasn't listened to a previous episode?
It's basically, so if you're talking about like relationship property between a couple, it's basically everything that you both accumulated together or contributed towards accumulating together during the time that you were together. It can also include things that you had prior to the relationship. So but if there was no contracting out agreement, then that's not excluded. So let's say in that scenario where like you have a house, if you don't have a contracting out agreement, that becomes relationship property for you and Ollie. And that can be just subject to then a 50-50 split as essentially the starting point. So obvious things are, like any property, things inside your property like contents and chattels.
What about inheritances?
Yes, also inheritances, also contributions from family members to potentially get yourself into a property, which is why they talk about, parents lending money to children. It's important to think about like how the structure of that is and whether it's an actual debt or it's a gift, because if my parents want to gift me some money and then I use that money to buy something that Luke and I own together, he is entitled to 50% of that, and they might be annoyed that that was meant to be a gift to solely benefit me. So thinking through those kinds of things, and then all your kind of standard stuff like cars,
shared ownership.
Interestingly, like KiwiSaver can come into that for both parties, any investment accounts, savings accounts, gifts, inheritances, all of that.
Also any like earned income over the period of your relationship as well, right?
Yes.
So the total sum of that will be considered.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, that's why I guess keeping a track of your balance sheet
is very important.
Really helpful, even if you don't have everything joint and even if you're not married, because if you're de facto, then you kind of need to know.
Yeah, for sure.
Information is power.
Yes.
Shall we say?
And
not that it's a war, but like if it was,
it comes,
you want the information. Even if
You
it's
wanna
a
be
friendly
well
battle,
informed,
you want the information.
Or you want to know people that have the information and that can help you as well. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, nice.
Exactly.
We also have a great podcast with Agreeable a few months ago that really digs into relationship property and the kind of intricacies around that and what is and isn't relationship property. So if you kind of want to dive deeper on that, feel free to go listen to that.
Yep.
Any other kind of tidbits or words of advice around financially breaking up with a partner or professional?
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I feel like the words of advice are different for the two things, where it's like breaking up with a financial professional or your family, I think is something that you hold the power on. And it's like, as you've said, just do it when it is appropriate, be honest, kind of stick to the facts, like come from a place of just kindness and being fair, and you'll be well grounded.
Well placed.
Well placed. When it comes to a partner, it's obviously very different because there's essentially like so much heightened emotion. And, you know, one thing that we've not really touched on is people not separating because they feel like they can't from a financial standpoint. And I can really like sympathize with that scenario. That would be super, super challenging. I guess, you know, divorce from a financial standpoint is not a good outcome for anyone. Right? You know, I think there's a little bit of a misnomer that sometimes like there are certain parties winning from a divorce, but the reality is that everybody is losing because you're taking a bigger pot, you know, and you think of like just your base level effects of compounding and growth as a unit is larger than as an individual. That's essentially just a fact. You know, it's why we're better together for so many different reasons, whether it's the relationship or friends or a business, whatever. And so there is no one winning. And if you can maybe just accept that and recognize that, hey, I'm going to kind of be back to square one, but I can make it through. Remove that as the barrier. Obviously make the best emotional
decision.
And a mental health decision for whatever you need to do.
Definitely.
And then get as much outside support from ideally some independent parties.
Before and after.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
And
before, during and after.
Key during.
All the times. All the times. Because I think, you know, and the after point is like a financial advisor is going to be best placed to be able to help you figure out how to like rebuild from where you're at. You know?
They can do all their projections and calculators.
Very
and
hard
stuff.
to figure that out by yourself and, you know, navigate that without probably feeling a little bit down and out and stressed. So
definitely.
10 out of 10 recommendation for an advisor. Post-divorce.
And if you're going through this personally yourself, also be kind to yourself because it's probably going to be stressful and potentially long and tiring. So make sure you try to take some time for yourself as well.
Well, exactly. On that, I had a friend recently who has been going through a separation and she was previously going to BFT, and she texted me the other day and she was like, look, can't go to BFT anymore because #budget life, got to like rein it in now that, you know, this is going to be my future. And she's like, I've joined a community gym, but she's like, positive, they've got a pool here and I'm going to the sauna every day. I don't think she's actually like working out. I think she's just like going to the spa and the sauna. But I was like, this is great. Like she's trying to find some kind of positive in what's otherwise a pretty crappy situation, and it's the reality of also having to like change certain lifestyle factors, but doing those things and being able to try and find some positivity in that is obviously really going to help you from a mental standpoint. Definitely. And so many grim topics on the pod recently.
We'll do some lighter ones next.
No more divorce and death.
No. We'll do growth and, I don't know, wellness or something.
Health, well-being, positivity, lovely mindsets.
Literally.
A bit of meditation.
Literally.
Fantastic.
We'll start the next episode with like 20-minute silence.
Okay, great. We could never.
Cool. So on that note, big thanks to Kernel for enabling us to do what we do. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe wherever you're tuning in, whether that's video on YouTube or listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you have questions, feel free to get in touch at It's No Secret on Instagram. Send us episode requests, feedback and more. But otherwise, until then, we will say see you later.
See ya.
Bye.